Throughout his 25 years with National Geographic, photographer Brian Skerry has suggested stories that resulted in groundbreaking articles for the magazine. From the heart seal's struggle to survive in a changing Arctic environment, to the staggering decrease in the world's fisheries, and the recognition that whales have culture, Brian's photographs drove home to our readers in a way that words never could, that our choices have consequences. Whether we wear harp seal fur, order the tuna dinner, or fail to consider whales as sentient creatures, our actions matter. Now, it can be dangerous to Google your friends, but I did take a quick look at Brian's bio. And a day at the office for Brian might mean watching your boat sink, being nipped by sharks, tangling with giant squid, being lost at sea, or in the case of whales, waiting and waiting and waiting for them to just show up. And this is all true. The boat did sink. When Brian isn't facing another death-defying day at sea, he's working tirelessly to ensure that his photographs have an impact. He frequently lectures on photography and conservation issues, presenting at a wide range of venues, from the classroom to TED Talks to the United Nations General Assembly. Brian understands better than most the need to translate issues into compelling photographs, that photography is that powerful conservation tool that we need. In fact, National Geographic was so impressed with Brian's photography and his commitment to ocean storytelling that he was selected to be a National Geographic Magazine Photography Fellow in 2014, a well-deserved honor followed up by being named a National Geographic Storytelling Fellow in 2017, as well as the Rolex National Geographic Explorer of the Year. And in addition to these accolades, he is also an Emmy Award-winning producer for the miniseries Secrets of the Whale. His colleagues have tremendous admiration and affection for him. Photographer David Duboulet told me that he used to joke that he was training his replacement. He says, "I watched with glee when Brian took on his own stories, then some sweat as he grew, and then cardiac arrest as he became a powerful voice for the seas. Now, I delight in the achievements of a man I consider a friend and a talent." Or as photographer Charlie Hamilton says, "To mix technically complex and physically demanding images with the elixir of emotion is very difficult to do. To do it underwater is just showing off." Steve Winter says, "I just love him like a brother." Finally, Brian's photographs simply inspire people to care about species, environments, and issues that don't seemingly impact our daily lives. From leatherback turtles to diverse marine environments, from aquaculture to global fisheries, from harp seals to tiger sharks, now whales. Thanks to his powerful photography, the underwater world has a champion. Please welcome Brian to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Well, I hope this doesn't suck after all that. Well, it is so great to be here in Siena. Thank you all for being here on a beautiful afternoon. Everybody ready to go for a swim? You know that's part of the deal, right? We're all going to do a little dive later. Anyway, well, it's a great honor to be able to share with you a little bit of my work here this afternoon with my presentation, Sentient Sea. You know, when Sergio first contacted me, many months ago, and invited me to have an exhibition here, and then asked what I wanted to call it, the first name that popped into my head was the Sentient Sea. Now, if you look up the word sentient in a dictionary, you'll find several definitions, but they all essentially say the same thing. The word sentient means aware, capable of feeling, or having knowledge. All things that I know to be true about wildlife. So as I was preparing this exhibit, and especially this presentation for today, I asked myself, what are the basic themes of my work? What is the fundamental thing that I've been trying to do as a photographer and a storyteller throughout my career? And my answer, as I thought about it, took me back to my earliest memories as a boy, growing up in a little country town in New England where I was fascinated with wildlife. You know, I joined a nature club when I was a young boy, and I would go birding every weekend looking for birds. And I collected bugs and brought home bees' nests. I rescued chipmunks that my family cat would have caught in the woods behind our house, and I would release them back into the woods where they inevitably got caught again. But I realized that my answer to that question, what is the fundamental thing that I've been trying to do with my work, is really the same thing that I've been trying to do my entire life. And that is to understand nature and to protect it. So my odyssey with, make sure this is working. There we go. My odyssey with wildlife and really the natural world truly found direction and purpose when I went into the sea. The experiences that I've had throughout my career, these moments underwater, have really exceeded even my wildest dreams. Dreams that began when I fell in love with the sea as a child, on those summer days when my parents would take me to beaches in Massachusetts and New England. And I became captivated with the mysteries of what lie beneath the waves offshore. I knew that I had to become an ocean explorer, and that meant, of course, becoming a scuba diver. So at about age 15, I took a certified scuba class and became a scuba diver. This is my very first scuba certification card. I know what you're thinking right now. You're saying, staggering how he hasn't changed in 46 years, and yeah, you're right. But you know, the other thing that happened soon after becoming a scuba diver was I learned that the way that I wanted to explore the ocean was with a camera. That notion of being able to share the pictures and things that I was learning with other people was really intoxicating to me. It's what I wanted to do. So I quickly gravitated towards underwater photography, and one of the first things that became immediately evident to me as an underwater photographer was that in order to make pictures underwater, I needed to get close to my subjects. You know, I didn't have the luxury of using telephoto lenses. I had to get typically within a meter or less of my subjects. And the amazing thing to me was that I was able to do that. Not always, of course, but with patience and dedication, I found that I could get very close to these animals. They would sometimes let me into their world, which was something that I never did on land. So in the process of getting close to these animals underwater, I found myself becoming hypnotized by the beauty of these animals, by the shape and form of animals that had been sculpted by eons of evolution in the sea. Animals like this blue shark that we see here that I photographed not too far from my home in New England, an animal that I always thought sort of looked like an aircraft with a slender fuselage-like body and these pectoral fins that looked like the wings of a glider. This little one, this blue shark had a little copepod, a parasitic copepod attached to its dorsal fin here, a little pelagic hitchhiker. Or the morphology of dolphins, like this pair of Indo-Pacific dolphins that I photographed in the waters off of South Korea. They represent this perfect representation of the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence in nature. We can look that up later if you're not familiar with that. But, you know, just the elegance of these animals and their perfect symmetry really enticed me. And, you know, it was everywhere I looked pretty much, on every dive underwater, I found these visually stunning patterns and colors on almost every nook and cranny that I looked in down there. Like animals like these mushroom corals that were vivid and beautiful. And I found myself, you know, looking into the viewfinder and getting lost for hours on shallow dives where I could just experiment at the shapes and patterns and colors, all really, you know, beautiful as a photographer. That intrigued me, and artistically it did too. But I knew that in order to really tell stories, I had to go beyond just shape and form and color. I really needed to understand what was happening in these ocean worlds. So I went off on assignment and began to try to tell stories. And so often when I go off on a new assignment and find myself diving in a new location, all I see is chaos all around me. There's fish swirling around and all this action that I don't really understand. So I've learned to sort of just focus in on individual behaviors or a single scene that helps lead me into these animals' worlds and allows me to begin telling that story. It might be a simple thing like a little blenny popping its head out of some coral here to feed, or it could be a delicate butterfly fish up in the water column being cleaned by another fish here, this little wrasse as we see here. You know, inevitably, all of these things are happening all around me, and I just need to zero in on one at a time to begin making order out of chaos. And in the process of doing that, you know, very mechanically trying to figure out what was going on so that I could tell a story, much more was revealed to me. I was seeing a real awareness with these animals and connections between them. I mean, certainly there was an awareness of me, of my presence underwater, as we can see with this school of black margate fish here that are looking very dubious about my presence underwater. It's just as if they're saying, you know, 1 inch closer, Skerry, and we're out of here. But it was more than just the presence of me down there. It was seeing relationships and alliances and connections. I was seeing communities that existed everywhere I looked, in every ocean habitat, and sentience. It was so much more that was going on down here that I still didn't understand, and honestly, to this day, don't fully understand. The more I explored, the more I went out further afield, I found myself discovering ancient rhythms and rituals that were occurring in the sea, like this spawning gathering of Kubera snapper that I photographed in the Mesoamerican Reef. This is an event that happens just for a few nights each year after the full moon in springtime, and it's an event that blends biology, astronomy, and oceanography. The fish come together, as I said, for just a few nights in April and May after the full moon to spawn, and they pick a very precise place in the ocean where the water is very deep. And then those fertilized eggs are carried by currents that bring the eggs into mangrove nurseries where the baby fish will be born, and they are, you know, protected from big predators. So it's all working like a perfectly engineered machine, which of course it is. So, you know, in looking even closer beyond awareness and communities and even ancient rituals, I was seeing personality. Now, despite being admonished by some of the early scientists I used to work with, I remember diving with shark scientists and so forth back in the 1980s, and I would talk about personality, and they would say, "Oh, no, you can't use that term for, you can't anthropomorphize with animals." And today, you know, they readily admit that that's okay. But I was certain back then and still today that what I was seeing was personality. Now, clearly, this was obvious with marine mammals like this rather well-behaved gray seal that we see here posing for his portrait up in the Gulf of Maine. And indeed, some of my most special experiences throughout my career have occurred with marine mammals where cognition and personality were very obvious. This was a picture that I made early one morning when I was photographing this female manatee that was feeding on seagrass, and she was kicking up, you know, these billowing clouds of silt all around her while her calf was tenderly perched on her back. So it was obvious that these animals had cognition and, you know, this empathy between each other. Or the time that I've spent with southern right whales in the subantarctic of New Zealand. You know, this was a population of whales that had never been photographed before and had allegedly never seen humans before. And I didn't know what I would find when I went there. It was a very speculative trip. But from the moment I arrived, these animals were extremely curious about me. This is a photo I made of my assistant standing on the bottom at a depth of about 20 meters or so with this 15 meter long right whale that weighed about 70 tons. It was extraordinary. This animal on that particular day spent more than 2 hours with us, just swimming along the bottom, sort of playing. So, you know, within a couple of days, I was able to make these full-frame images of this very soulful eye, this eye that was studying me. They were as intrigued about me as I was about them. It really had a profound effect on me and continued to, percolate in my mind over the years. So, saying that marine mammals have personality is probably something that most people would agree with or accept. But what about a tiny fish? I think this might be a stretch for a lot of people to think that a little fish has personality, but I think they do. The more time that I spend with animals, particularly the same animals or many animals within a given species, I think I really do see personality. This was a tiny little goby that I found living inside an abandoned soda can one day in Suruga Bay, Japan. I remember that morning swimming down to a depth of about 30 meters, and there was some ocean debris on the sea floor. And as I swam past, a little flash of color caught my eye. So I got down on my belly and I sort of inched closer on my elbows, and he sort of just drifted in the doorway of his little mobile home here and allowed me to make a picture that I think resonates with personality, which I think he exuded. What about sharks? Again, I think that most people would never think that a shark has personality. There's still a lot of misinformation about these animals out there, but I think they do. And I think we need no further evidence that sharks have personality than when we see a smiling white shark, like this guy here that was clearly very happy to see me jump in the water in South Australia that morning, just grinning from ear to ear, looking for a playmate that day. But seriously, I do think that even animals like sharks, or especially animals like sharks, do indeed have personality. The more time, as I said, that I spend in a given place and get to see individual animals, and especially when there's many of that species around, then you see with sharks that some are a little bit more relaxed, others a little bit more feisty. And that can, of course, vary on day to day, but I do see these patterns sort of emerging. This was a female tiger shark that I made this portrait of in the Bahamas. I'd spent a little over 2 weeks doing a tiger shark story, and I saw, at least a dozen tiger sharks almost every day. And this was a beautiful female that exuded this elegant confidence. She wasn't overly aggressive. Day after day, she would swim in. And I wanted to make a picture that sort of respected that. And this one day, she was rising up to the surface with these 3 little barjacks, these little silver fish swimming off her nose, and I sort of intersected her, and the light from my strobes and the sunlight created a shadow on her face of those 3 little fish. And it ended up being the lead picture in that story, and I think it was indeed more respectful. It's not hard to make scary pictures of sharks with teeth and jaws and blood, but this was a little bit more respectful of an animal that has long been portrayed as a monster. So as my career evolved, it was all of these things that really inspired me. The exquisite shapes, the colors, the forms that I was seeing underwater. It was the mysteries of sentience, of personality, the relationships, the connections that are occurring in the sea. These were the secrets that stirred my soul, the thing that kept me awake at night and made me want to go back in, spend as much time underwater to begin putting together that grand oceanic puzzle as a storyteller. But around the same time that the light was beginning to go on, that I was seeing the light in the ocean, I was also beginning to see the dark side of what was happening on Earth's oceans. And every single assignment that I would go on, and nearly every dive, I was seeing devastation and destruction occurring beneath the waves. I've often believed that the ocean suffers from a bit of a curse, that it has this beautiful exterior that most people see, which hides what's happening below. Now, historically, it hides a lot of the beauty that's down there, but more often these days, it's hiding all of these terrible things that are happening as well. This is a photo that I made while working on a story about the problems of overfishing, the problems of commercial, industrialized overfishing, that we have taken 90% of the big fish out of the ocean post-World War II in the last 60 or so years. And one of the places I worked on that story was in the shark fishing world, where back then and still today, we kill more than 100 million sharks every single year. I wanted to make a picture that drew some empathy for that. And I saw this thresher shark this particular morning that, as I looked through my viewfinder, it struck me as a crucifixion. And I thought that maybe that would bring some empathy. This was the lead picture in what was a cover story at the magazine in 2007. And again, I want to reiterate, these were not the kinds of photos that I wanted to make. These were not the pictures I dreamed about making. But as a journalist, I felt a sense of responsibility and a sense of urgency to turn my camera toward these issues and tell a more complete story about what was happening to our oceans in order to fix those problems. If we don't know about them, we can't fix them. And one of the things I wanted to do with this story, I spent 2 years working on it around the world, but one of the key components was I wanted to show readers, I wanted to show people how seafood is caught, because it's not like other things that we eat. This is one of the most common methods of fishing in the world. It's called a trawl net. And this was a small one that was being used in Mexico to catch shrimp, but it's used on a much grander scale all over the world. Essentially, the way it works is you have a net with floats on the top and a lead-weighted line on the bottom, and you've got two big steel doors on either end, and that entire assembly is towed behind a fishing boat, and when those doors meet resistance from the water, it helps to open the mouth of the net. So as you can imagine, it's very good at catching whatever the intended species was. This was a bottom trawl in Mexico being used to catch shrimp, so the shrimp just bounce into the net. But as you can also maybe envision, it is indiscriminate. It catches everything in its path, and because this was a bottom trawler being towed over the bottom, it effectively clear cuts that precious benthic layer, all these other animals that are living on the bottom that have no commercial value and will be caught as incidental kill. So this is a picture I made of the fisherman's hands holding the shrimp that he caught after towing that net for 1 hour. And all those other animals that are dead on the deck of his boat that you see underneath his hands are what's known as bycatch. These are the animals that are caught in the process and will be thrown back into the sea as trash. So in many places in the world, this is the true cost of a shrimp dinner. 7 or 8 shrimp and maybe 8 kilos of other fish that will be thrown back into the sea as trash. And to make that point even more visual, I swam under that shrimp boat as they were shoveling that bycatch back into the sea and photographed this cascade of death. Animals like bat rays and guitarfish and baby flounder that only an hour before were alive on the bottom of the ocean. At the time I was doing this story, the statistic was something like 60 billion pounds of bycatch every year was caught and destroyed because, again, it had no value. So that's what I wanted people to understand. So as important as it is and was for me to shine a light on those problems, we have to know about it, I also felt that we needed to offer solutions. And in that same cover story in 2007, we did a separate story, Kathy and I did a separate story on the value of protecting the oceans. And I think the greatest solution that we can have for protecting the oceans is to create more marine protected areas. These are places that are left alone, that are off limits to any type of extraction, whether it's fishing or drilling or anything, and we allow the sea to restore itself. And I ended up going to New Zealand to do this story because back then and still today, New Zealand has a very progressive conservation ethic. And in the ocean, they have created a network of MPAs, of marine protected areas, around their EEZ, their oceans. And you can see this restoration. And this was a photo I made, for example, in the south of New Zealand, in Fiordland, a very shadowy Lord of the Rings kind of place. And this was a place where rivers flow into the sea that are stained with tannin, and it blocks out the sunlight, so you get the emergence of deep water animals. This was a type of coral known as sea pens that usually are found in deep water, but here I made this image in about 70 feet of water, about 20 plus meters of water. And you can imagine it's such a fragile ecosystem. It's like a china closet, and if a single trawl net like the one we saw a moment ago came through, it would destroy it forever, and it would disappear with a whimper. Nobody would even know, A, that it existed, or B, that it was gone. But it's valuable to us. We need everything that the ocean gives us. Or in the north of New Zealand, where I made this picture of abundance and diversity. This was a very stormy day that the boat captain didn't even want to go out, but I had an image like this in my mind's eye. And the reason that I had this image in my mind's eye is because the day before, I was having tea with an old-time Kiwi diver, a guy who began diving back in the 1950s in this place in New Zealand. And over tea, his name was Wade Doak, and over tea he told me, he said, you know, Brian, I think that the marine life is better in this place today than it was when I started diving back in the 1950s. And as I left him and was preparing my equipment for the next day's dive, it sort of dawned on me that nobody's ever said that to me before. Everywhere I go in the world, people say, you should have been here 10 years ago. The corals were better, the sharks were better, the fish were better. But here was a place that was better today than it was in the 1950s simply because they made it a marine protected area in the 1980s. So I think the message is clear that nature is resilient and tolerant to a point, but we must see and we must take action. And you know, again, MPAs are critical. I think every government that has an ocean attached to it needs to be creating these legislatively. That's what we need to support. But as important as MPAs are, to me, again, in my quest as a storyteller and somebody who cares about the ocean, I don't think that they truly address the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is sort of this lack of respect and reverence for wildlife. So another approach that I have taken with my photography, with my storytelling, is to do stories that sort of celebrate the magnificence of ocean wildlife, animals that most people probably wouldn't have any reason to know anything about, while, you know, sort of juxtaposing them with some of the damage that's occurring. This is a story I did about bluefin tuna, one of the most magnificent animals in the world, and my pitch to Kathy and the team was I wanted to put a face on seafood. You know, I think so many of us just don't think about much of the food we're eating, although with terrestrial animals, we know what they are. You know, we go to dinner with some friends and somebody orders chicken and we know what a chicken is, and somebody orders a steak maybe and we know where a steak comes from. But when you're eating bluefin tuna sushi, I wondered how many people have any concept of this magnificent animal that they're consuming. You know, the bluefin tuna has no terrestrial counterpart. It's an animal that continues to grow its entire life. If we weren't so efficient at catching them, there'd be 30-year-old bluefin out there that weigh a ton, but they don't get anywhere near that big these days because we're way too good at catching them. They're effectively a warm-blooded fish. They can generate heat in their body, and they can swim practically from the equator to the poles in search of their prey. They crisscross the entire ocean in the course of the year, tens of thousands of miles. There's no land predator or anything like that, but yet today they are on the brink of extinction in many places. This was the lead picture from that story that we did in Geographic, and again, the idea was to use science, you know, that the text and the captions would talk about the magnificence of their biology, their morphology, how they are superior animals, and help with the images to get people to appreciate this while juxtaposing it to what happens to these animals everywhere they are found. This is a photo that I made of a fishery known as the Almadraba fishery in Spain. It's actually an ancient method, the matanza. They have them in Italy as well. And it's actually a more sustainable method of catching bluefin, but other methods like purse seine netting and so forth do the real damage. But collectively, when all of those fish are killed and caught, they end up usually at the Tsukiji fish market in Tokyo, Japan, where every single morning at about 4 a.m. the bodies are lined up like cordwood and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Single bluefin tuna have sold in this auction for in excess of $1 million US. So you can imagine with a bounty on their head like that, we might very well catch the very last one. So, you know, for me, the notion of celebrating wildlife magnificence, the notion of elevating animals for their appreciation, for their magnificence, doesn't in any way diminish us. It doesn't diminish humans, but it might actually result in a more informed and empathetic decision when people are making decisions about how to take care of our planet. And that's kind of one of the end games. So this sort of leads me to one of my most recent projects, Secrets of the Whales, which in many ways is a continuation of everything that I've been trying to do for all these decades, but it also goes much deeper, no pun intended. I created Secrets of the Whales using the latest and greatest science that is revealing that whales not only have sentience, but they have culture. and culture sort of being defined as genetically identical animals within a given species doing things differently depending where in the world they live and how they were taught. One way to look at culture is it can be described as, behavior is what we do, culture is how we do it. So most people eat food with utensils, that is behavior, but whether you use a fork and knife or chopsticks is your culture. Well, it turns out whales are kind of doing the same thing. This was released as a multimedia project in 2021. It was a 40-page cover story in National Geographic magazine, a book that I wrote and photographed, and a 4-part documentary series, which is streaming still on Disney+. If you haven't seen it, or maybe if you have, this is what the trailer for the film series looked like. So as I began to start building this story, extrapolate from one species to another, working with scientists to understand the notion of culture and how it could be photographed or documented, I realized that whales are doing so many things like us. They segregate by dialect or language. They have regional cuisine preferences, ethnic foods, if you will. They have singing competitions, and they even take vacations or holidays at their favorite beach in the summertime. The more I learned about this idea of whale culture, the more that I was convinced that telling these stories could really be a bit of a game changer. That if we could begin to see our planet through the lens of culture with another species, it could change not only our view of the ocean, but really our relationship to nature. To see it as a place where other families live, families not so different than our own, families that celebrate their identity, their relationships, and their traditions, many of which are ancestral, ancient traditions. Relationships like the one between a humpback whale mom and its calf. The mother humpback invests a great deal of energy in her offspring. It's a year-long gestation period. And then after that little calf is born, she spends another year almost joined at the hip, just teaching it all the skills that it will need to survive in the ocean. But not only the skills, but these traditions, things that she would have learned from her mother and, all the way down the line that are important to her and important to her family. I have another little video clip from the humpback whale episode of Secrets of the Whales that I wanted to share with you right now. It talks about this bond of the mother and calf between humpback whales. Let's have a look.
This newborn male also takes in the tunes. It could be another 10 years or more before he's ready to introduce his own song variations. For now, he's listening, learning, and exploring. And he discovers quite the curiosity.
He kind of got a glimpse of me, and it was almost like he's just stopped and, it was kind of like, whoa, who are you? It's like a human toddler. It's like a little child that, sees things for the first time.
Brian is a strange-looking, one-eyed creature with a tube for a mouth. It seems worthy of show and tell. lion follows the calf to its mom and gets a rare glimpse of humpback whale kinship.
Just really sense this emotional bond. That's really special. These moms invest so much time in their calves. And the calves stay with the moms for about a year. And during that period, Mom is teaching them so many things that they need to know to live. It's learned behavior. It's what humans do. Those family relationships are as important to them as families are to us. Pretty humbling to be in their presence. Well, the next species of whale that I briefly wanted to share with you from Secrets of the Whales is the sperm whale, an animal that is much more elusive even than the humpback. They roam the open oceans and live in tightly knit groups that are known as family units that are matrilineal. They're led by the older, wiser females of the group that make all the decisions for the family. They're also the animal with the biggest brain of any animal on Earth. In fact, they have the biggest brain of any animal that has ever lived on Earth. But understanding how they use those big brains has really been a challenge. They are somewhat cryptic animals. But for Secrets of the Whales, I worked in a number of locations around the world. But one of the key locations was in Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean, where a friend of mine, Shane Garrow, has been studying them. He's a Canadian scientist, but he's been studying them there for about 17 years. And one of the key focuses of his research is their language, their dialects. And it's fascinating stuff. He's identified about 30 families that live in these waters occasionally. They're not resident. They don't live there year-round, but they come and go. And in those 30 families, they're all speaking the same dialect, the same language. And the fascinating thing is that they don't intermingle with other genetically identical sperm whales that happen to come into those waters as well. He said that when two sperm whales meet each other in the middle of the ocean, the first thing they do is say who they are and where they're from. So I am from Dominica. And if the other whale says they're from Haiti, they just go their separate way. There's no fighting, no wars. But, again, it reminded me when I first heard this of humans. It reminded me of neighborhoods of New York City at the turn of the last century, where you had all these little neighborhoods based on language, and they were all genetically the same creatures, but they were isolating based on language. So fascinating stuff. So their language, their dialects, are kind of like a Morse code clicking. This is what it sounds like when they're socializing. So I learned just enough sperm whale to know that what they were saying that day was, there's that idiot with the camera over there, so we're going to swim this way so he can't keep taking our picture. Well, on to orca, which I would say are arguably the most intelligent animal in the ocean, an animal that I could easily have done an entire project on or spend the rest of my life trying to reveal their secrets. But with orca, I really wanted to focus on their feeding strategies. The fact that as the most clever animal in the ocean, they are capable of eating anything they want, but they choose very specific things the way they were taught by their mother and grandmother or where in the world they live. So, for example, in Patagonia, Argentina, there are just 2 families of orca that have a taste for sea lion pups, and at a certain time of the year when the pups are beginning to go into the water, they have figured out a strategy. These matrilineal females have devised a strategy to go up on the beach and grab a pup. On the other side of the planet in New Zealand, the orca have a taste for stingrays, and once again, they have come up with a strategy where they move into shallow water mangroves and harbors and delicately pick up a stingray. They often turn it upside down in what's known as tonic immobility. Some sharks and rays go immobile when you turn them upside down, and then the other members of the family come in and take a bite. They food share. So fascinating that, the same animal, 2 different worlds, they like different things to eat, like humans. In the Norwegian Arctic, a place that I first worked back in 1994, I went back for Secrets of the Whales. These are not resident orca. They migrate in the autumn, in the fall, following the migrations of herring, a type of fish that they like to eat. And they do this just a few weeks before the polar night, when it'll be dark 24 hours a day. And historically, the way that they have fed on those herring are to work together as a family cooperatively, and they use their very rich repertoire of dialects and language and so forth to give instructions. And here we see one of the orca sort of corralling, sort of, like a sheepdog, herding those fish into a tight bait ball, and then they swim through, they whack them with their tail and stun them, and then they eat them. So that was always the way it was, and even when I went in 1994, this is what you would see. But more often than not, these days, the orca are not doing that wild behavior. They're actually doing what's known as depredation. They're hanging out next to commercial fishing boats where the boat is pulling in a net filled with tons of herring, and inevitably some of those fish fall out of the net and they get an easy meal. So the researcher said it's actually quite rare these days to see that natural carouseling behavior, as it's called. And I was able to make friends. It's illegal to dive on a fishing boat when they're working, but I made friends with a crew out there, and I was able to dive underneath and get a photo of the net with one of these fish spilling out of it. And this was an orca that had been playing a game with me. At first I was just free diving. Almost all the work that I do is just breath hold diving with whales. But every time I got down there to hold position at about 10 meters or so, the orca would stop and wait for me to go back up to get a breath, and then he would come in and eat the fish. So I went back and put a little pony bottle, a little scuba tank on, and I noticed when I could hold position now that his behavior changed. It wasn't threatening, but it was as if he was saying, look, don't even think about eating that fish. That's my fish. So anyway, I have a little behind the scenes video that I thought would be fun of me doing that very thing. Exhilarating to be in the presence of orca. Well, the last species that I wanted to share with you briefly here is the beluga whale, an animal that has been historically really hard to study because they live in the high Arctic, places where there's really not much infrastructure. If you want to work there, you have to bring everything with you. The population that I worked with for Secrets of the Whales spends the winter time in the waters off of Greenland, where it is dark 24 hours a day, and then in the summertime, they migrate hundreds of kilometers through the Northwest Passage of Canada to arrive at a place in the Canadian high Arctic known as Somerset Island. This is an estuary ecosystem where a river flows into the sea. Did anyone else hear that, or is that just is the presence of the Holy Spirit? Nice. It's just when I talk, I guess. Anyway, well, if that doesn't keep happening, I'll try to get through this. So this is a place where if you go for a couple of weeks in the summertime, you can see hundreds or thousands of beluga whales in this very unique ecosystem. It's an uninhabited island up there in the Canadian high Arctic. And this is a drone photo that shows mothers and babies. It's actually a group maternity ward where you can see so many in one place. Rather unique in the animal kingdom, I believe. The babies are born darker in color. They're more of gray or brown, and sometimes ride on the mother's back, which you see here. And using a passive underwater remote camera system that I built with National Geographic, I was able to make the very first photos of a newborn baby beluga. You're not allowed to go in the water here. The Canadian government has given some level of protection to this place. And the truth is, if I even tried to put a toe in the water, I would have created a stampede of 1,000 whales. But with this passive underwater camera system, I was able to get these very unique images, in this case, a baby beluga. A new scientific paper came out recently that reveals that when a baby beluga is born, it gets the same name by the family as its mother. And then when it stops speaking gibberish and actually begins speaking proper beluga speak, they give it its own name. So fascinating aspect of their culture. This little guy was maybe hours old, still had fetal folds on his body right out of the womb, a natural performer smiling for the camera. And one of the last things I wanted to share was a real surprise that we were able to capture, and that was gameplay. with beluga whales. You know, I had done a cover story on dolphin intelligence a few years ago for National Geographic, and I knew that dolphins, you know, exhibit intelligence by playing games with seaweed and leaves in the water. But we didn't know that belugas do it. But with this system, I was able to get this image of this game that they play with little rocks, little stones. It's a game of stones, I guess. Anyway, where they pick up a perfect pebble, they find a little rock that they like, they carry it around for a while, then they drop it, and inevitably there's another beluga behind them that then picks it up and, you know, continues the game. I don't know all the rules, but, you know, as I thought about this after this project, it just sort of made me feel good that there are these animals out there whose lives are very difficult, right? They spend all winter in total darkness in the icy Arctic. Then they have to migrate hundreds of kilometers and dodge polar bears and icebergs. And then there are social situations up there with 1,000, you know, beluga whales, no doubt gossipy belugas that are a real problem. But you know, they pick up a perfect pebble and carry it around with them because it makes them happy. It brings them joy. And I think there's a real message there. So in closing, I just wanted to offer some final thoughts. You know, I guess my hope is that if there is a takeaway from my work, that it's less about a need to specifically save individual species, but rather to be reminded of just how magical our planet really is. And with these reminders and revelations, we become better caretakers of our planet and protect what we love. And in doing so, we not only save whales or sharks or coral reefs, but save everything. Thank you very much.